Welcome, everybody, to the Hopeful Rebel. I am Pastor Allen, and you are?
Pastor Wesley.
Pastor Terrence.
And our special guest today is none other than the legend himself, the Jedi Master of mind tricks, the Obi-Wan Kenobi of your soul, the Luke Skywalker of your heart, Dr. Hud McWilliams.
Good morning. Thanks for being here.
Okay, so we have to be here. So
well, if you weren't, I wouldn't. So that seemed appropriate.
What's in the mug, Hud? What's in the mug today?
Bay Hills tea.
Bay Hills tea.
The specialty this morning.
Special tea.
It should start to kick in about 30 minutes.
Can we brand it like that? Bay Hills Special Tea?
We can. We should do that.
Okay.
We really should do that.
You should. Excellent.
All right. So today, you happen to be joining us in the middle of a mental health series that we're doing at Bay Hills called Bloodlines, which is essentially about generational trauma and the implications of generational trauma. And I think to frame our discussion today, we want to kind of keep it into two categories, and which is some churches overemphasize this, and some churches underemphasize this, meaning they don't want to talk about it at all. Well, which side would you guys like to start on? What do you think, Doc?
My experience is most church experience is to underemphasize it and spiritualize it in some way.
Okay, so let's talk about the underemphasis side of it. So maybe it would be helpful if we just kind of go around. I've never been in a church that touched a mental health subject. And there are lots of reasons for that, and we can talk maybe about a few of those. That would be fun. Terrence, any?
Not in a healthy way at all. I've only seen it done where it comes as if anything that happens to you from a spiritual or a mental health position is a spiritual attack, but it's never been an actual clinical discussion.
So then it gets framed as spiritual warfare.
Exactly.
Is what you're saying.
Exactly.
El Diablo.
Yes.
The devil did it.
Or worse, he made me do it.
The devil did it. Why have you not been baptized?
Well, or everything's a demon.
Yeah.
If there's something wrong with you, I mean, we push it away from there being any kind of possible integrative discussion. Integrative meaning it's complicated. We want it to be simplified, and I think what this does is demands more complexity to talk about it. In other words, you've got the spiritual dynamic and a physical dynamic and a historical dynamic and a psychological one and an emotional one and an economic one and a cultural one, and they all feed the beast, if you will, so to speak. And so
you grew up Baptist, right?
I did.
And
they never talked about it.
They didn't want to talk about this subject.
No. Because, I mean, a good friend of mine who's now dead, and I just stumbled onto an article he wrote the other day, and I told my wife, I said, I really like this article. And she said, why? And I said, this is the first time I've looked at who writes these articles. And this was this friend of mine, and he introduced psychology to seminaries and took a hit culturally in America because he was the early adopter and just said, we need to integrate this in our thinking and our teaching.
You knew the Apostle Paul.
I did.
That's amazing.
I
did not.
It comes from being really old, actually.
All right, Wesley, have you experienced any meaningful? I know you have listening to podcast stuff. I'm talking about in a church you've attended.
Yeah, so the conversations within a church context about mental health for me have always happened off of the stage. So not meaningful and thoughtful teaching or preaching on the subject, but I think especially by nature of the generation that I come from, it's a hot topic. Everyone wants to talk about mental health and anxiety. And so the friends that I grew up with in a church context had a lot to say about mental health. But to me, a lot of the information came off as sort of underinformed or even like sometimes contradictory to what was being taught from the pulpit, from the stage. So it's been challenging for me to kind of reconcile those two worlds because I feel like I have a very secular view of psychology that, I was taught in school and that a lot of my peers adhere to, and then trying to marry that to what I'm being taught in a church context from the stage has been a very challenging sort of.
Well, it's hard because, like, for Terrence, he's saying that on his side, this gets framed as spiritual warfare. My experience with this subject historically was it gets framed as there's something sort of defective with your faith. And like, hey, Jesus is orientating you to the future. Like, leave the past behind and strip off everything that clings so closely to you. And so it's somehow you are not enough of, like, what does it say about Jesus if you still have issues that you can't let go of?
Well, one of the things that I grew up Free Will Baptist, which I call lack of Free Will Baptist, and
That's why it's in the title.
that's exactly.
Predestined Baptist.
But one of the things that I experienced was I think I know why they went the route they did is because within the context of church, especially if you're from a Baptist background, a lot of times the family members who have caused the trauma are sitting next to you in the pew. And so you either have the opportunity to damage a relationship about talking about what happened before you, or you try to drive people towards just quickly sprinting past what happened before them and sprint into something that's more hopeful when they actually don't even have the tools to get to that point.
Okay, so what do you think? Why are we afraid to talk about this in the church? Why are we are we afraid of getting secular cooties? What's going on?
Well, there's to me, the last frontier of theology is anthropology. So it's what's on the table right now, historically. So we've gone from the Middle Ages, big view of God, frightening all the time, to more personal, etc. Now we're dealing with the human themselves, and I think there's such a stigma to having anything wrong with you that we want to explain it away in some way. So if we can say, all this little controversy, all addiction is driven by some kind of disease model. Well, there is a component to addiction that fits into the disease model, but it doesn't explain the whole thing because we're more dense than that. We're more layered than that. We're more finesse than that, et cetera. So, and there are reasons for people to be depressed in a fallen world. And there are, and most people that are geniuses actually carry a lot of depression with them. A lot of leaders do. And that, so instead of normalizing it and then being able to wrestle with it in some way, we've tried to push it out of the conversation completely and sidebar it, or
it's almost like a little bit of Gnosticism gets inherited into the church a little bit, which is, talking about all things to do with the body. Or for those that don't know, Gnosticism, that was a cult that believed in the ancient times that all things having to do with the body was bad. And so, like, enlightenment was really about getting away from the physical, from the real, from the body especially. And I think we've imported some of that into our theological discussion and thinking. It's like, oh, no, the body doesn't matter. All that matters now is the soul, the spiritual. And meanwhile, the bodies are wreaking havoc on people's lives, and we're not talking about it.
That's Platonism as well. I mean, that's what drove that philosophically. And when I use the word integration to me is where we ultimately get the word holiness from. So something that has integrity means that all these pieces fit together. And so and the opposition of our adversary is his name, its name, is to split us, to fragment us, to separate us, to divide us in some way. Well, a lot of what we would call mental illness today are these fragments having a louder voice than the rest and unintegratable in some way. Maybe it's contextual, or maybe it's a church that couldn't ever teach an integrative approach or whatever. I mean, there are people still today that say this is all because of sin.
Okay, so how much of this is also because of the how do I say this in a way that's kind? And I really do mean that. A lack of training, emphasis, or ability on the pastor to wade into these waters, and so then it gets spiritualized as a smokescreen for those things. That I don't have training because seminary doesn't really train it very well. I've not grown or learned about any of this because it's not really emphasized in the church historically, and so because I don't know how to help people with this, I don't know how to integrate the Scripture, which has a lot to say about anxiety, depression, and trauma and generational issues or whatever. I don't know how to do that, so then I smoke screen it with these things don't really matter. All that matters is going forward.
I use a word. I like to try to normalize it, I guess would be the way to say it. In a fallen world, this is a normal experience. It's not aberrant out there in some way. This is part of what it means to live in a marred world, a upside-down world, a fragmented world, a distorted world, etc. And so if I can normalize it, then I can talk about it straight up. If I push it off in some segment, then it becomes stigmatized in some way. My dad was depressed. He couldn't take the help that was available to him. I mean, he couldn't gin up the interior courage to take the help that was presented to him because it was such a stigma in his world to go to a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a counselor or anybody, or even to approach a pastor for help, other than just prayer, for instance. I'm not minimizing prayer, please, but the point.
Can I ask you a question carefully but deliberately? You have now met with thousands at this point of leaders and pastors.
Mm-hmm.
If you were going to ballpark a percentage that has a desire and or an awareness of what's going on inside of them, their IQ in that area, when they come to you, where would you say most of them land? Bottom third, middle third, top third? Where is...
There's a rule of thumb about mental health that maybe is helpful, and it shows up in healthy families or healthy individuals or healthy systems, and the data keeps coming back the same percentage-wise. It's about 7 to 10% falls in that category over and over and over. It's not magic. So it's probably not causal, but anytime it's studied, that's where it lands. So happy, functional, resilient, robust, hardy marriages, for instance, 7 to 10%. So it's about that space that you're going to be working with, and people that kind of can integrate this and draw these elements together, these things that need to be integrated together. So I've got to talk about the fact that my physiology affects my psychology, affects my personality. I mean, they all interact in some way, and I've got to give them weight. And then maybe this will help just a little bit. It's kind of a sidebar, but I think one of the things I look for when I talk to somebody is I want them to play, this is my term, I want them to play the God card last. Don't spiritualize this. It's not that there's not a spiritual dynamic to it. There probably is. But let's play that last. Let's see your responsibility. Can you take as much responsibility getting to that card where we get down on our knees and pray and ask God for help and assistance, et cetera. But if we need to clear out the debris that we've either created or been given to us in some way, recognize it, normalize it, have access to it, be able to talk about it, or we're going to be out of luck in my mind.
What do you think is, or at least that you have seen, are the most common things that are inhibiting that other 90 to 93% from making meaningful progress?
Well, growing is a test. Maturing is a test. Maybe that's the easiest way to think about it. And most people don't like taking tests. So if you take a test and what the test is going to show you is either you're maturing or you're not maturing, and you have a choice. And there's not a dead space in there. There's not a neutral space. You're either growing or you're not growing. And so each test tells you that. And when you interact with your kids or when you interact with your boss or your mate or whatever, it's always a test. And I think we don't normalize that, so people want to avoid the uncomfortableness of taking a test and being exposed, because that's what a test does. It exposes what you know, how you've grown, what kind of maturity. Are you facing this? Are you dealing with it? So some of the things that you've uncovered in this series in your own soul is you've gone back and you've tested your own family system and tried to uproot or plow up that ground and see what's there. Is there something that I need to offload or put in a category that it was front and center and it doesn't deserve to be front and center? I can't get rid of it, but I can put it in its place. And so I think the biggest issue for most people is they don't have the capacity, maybe, or the model would be a better term. They have the capacity, they just don't have and they have the potential, they just don't have the model to encourage them to say, hey, this is okay. You can do this.
Well, think about the domino effect systemically, meaning I'm talking about for church history, at least modern church history, which is, if it's 7 to 10%, meaning basically 90% don't have a model, they therefore can't be a model. Therefore, we're producing Christians who aren't a model and can't be a model, because if the leaders won't talk about this, then the church isn't going to talk about this. And then we're just producing more and more sort of milk addicted Christians, believers, and we just keep perpetuating this sort of lack of development within the church.
Yeah, because I hear a number like that, and I try and put my ego to the side and say, there's a very real possibility for myself and even for the people that are listening right now that they fall into that 90% camp. Even though we all want to believe that we're, the 1 in 10 person that is doing the thing they're supposed to be, the reality of the stat says that most of us are not. So if that's where most people are, how can they identify?
Don't worry,
how can they remove?
You are definitely in the elite category, Wesley.
Oh, never mind.
Of course.
All right, conversation
Of
over.
course.
I'm going to go home and savor my excellence.
Of course.
You're in charge. But how can the average listener, how can even the 4 of us sitting at this table remove our own ego and subjectivity enough to get a realistic look at, maybe I am in that 90%, and now what do I do with that?
Yeah, I think
Great question.
I think the first thing is, and I've mentioned it just a second ago, we have the potential. We have the potential to not be, and to be in the 7 to 10%. We can move. We are designed to mature, etc. One of my little quip for this is, I think our adversary primarily wants to keep us infant. That's my way of saying it. So C.S. Lewis has an interesting concept, if I can make it verbally visual. He says we need to add density, substance to our own souls, which doesn't mean that you have a new soul. It just means that you begin to add substance to it. And I keep meeting pastors, which you mentioned earlier, that have what I call a shriveled soul syndrome, which is thinned out. So you look at a person on the outside and you can't tell. You can't tell whether...
Might be really dynamic, might be really
Absolutely.
organized, might be an incredible speaker, leader.
charismatic, all that kind of stuff, mover and a shaker, influencer, and yet hollow on the inside. And you'll see it. It'll show up in their kids, or it shows up in their marriage, if you can scratch the surface of that. And we have, I could name names. I don't think it's important right now, but
No, please.
I could just
give us the names. We have plenty of time.
I've got my pen out. Let's go.
I'm going to pull up the Bay Hill stat page, and I just want you to walk through it.
We will check the list.
We will skip me.
Link 1 for yes, 2 for times for.
We'll have that over pin, that just crosses everything out. But I think what you see over and over again, pastors blowing up, imploding, failing, flailing around, doing something.
Philip Yancey.
Yeah.
Holy smokes, guy just spent a lifetime,
That's right. And he's just one in a long line. And so if you step back from that and you're not pointing fingers, but you're trying to say, what is the dynamic that keeps this reality alive? Why does it keep showing up? And why is it seemingly so regular? And I think it's because we don't normalize this, so it gets hidden or sublimated or suppressed or something. And instead of it being exposed, well, the garden was about exposure. That's what a test is designed to do. It's designed to expose your level of development.
And some of that the church is kind of it's this sort of self-feeding entity, which is like the pastor would talk about it maybe if he felt like he wasn't going to be fired for talking about how he's doing
Right.
and what's going on in his life, and that he wasn't just going to get replaced right away. But then we need pastors to talk about it to create churches that won't fire people for doing it. It's this awful, catch-22 cycle.
Yeah, and that's the hard thing. I love the fact that you said normalize this. People get mad at me sometimes where I say, yes, I am a pastor, but you have to understand, and I always say it this way, I am a regular schmegular person.
Schmegular?
Schmegular. Meaning that I struggle with things that everyone struggles with. And unfortunately, what you see with pastors, they elevate themselves to a point where they're afraid to talk about what's going on for fear of losing the trust of the people who are out in the worship center.
Most people don't struggle with floating.
That's it. I have talked about that from the stage, funny enough.
Which is the only reason I said it now. I wouldn't have done you like that if you had not outed yourself.
I can swim as long as I don't stop. And then it's game over at that point.
Okay. All right, go ahead.
But quite honestly, I mean, that's the thing we have to understand, that every single person who is in the room, every single person who is there is a regular person.
Yeah,
And we have to learn how to normalize this, because you're exactly right. Pastors get to a point where they have to shield what's going on, and it's only exposed when it blows up. And that's a problem. We have to normalize it.
There's a quote by J.K. Rowling. I don't know if you know who that
Harry
is.
Harry Potter.
She said,
Slytherin.
rock bottom
Gryffindor.
became the foundation for the rest of my life. Now think about that.
Say that
quote.
one more time.
Wow.
Rock bottom became the foundation for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
Now think about that. She actually wound up with more money than the Queen had, I think, at one point. So she went from rock bottom to that, but she still says the anchor point for her is rock bottom. Now that means that we've eliminated the posturing, the posing, the personality, cult, celebrity thing, and we've said, I'm like everybody else. I'm as prone to, I'm as vulnerable as, I don't get exception. I mean, I was working with couples for years before I finally swallowed the pill that said, if you're a couple, you're contributing. Whatever's going on, you're a contributor. You better own it, And that turned our marriage in a healthier direction. We started toward the 7 to 10% at that point in time. I won't tell you where we started from, though. -2 maybe or something.
Yeah. Okay, so that then takes us, sort of to the other side of the coin, all right, which is, I think a lot of people, and maybe rightly so, especially in a condition and a culture of things like trauma farming and trauma mining, and everything is a trauma, everything is, making me the V word, a victim, and so they're worried about that infiltrating the church, and where that's all we're talking about is, in other words, we're capitulating to that sort of framework for thinking, which is that you don't have any real victory in Christ, you don't have a new nature in Christ, and we're almost subversively or explicitly saying that you can't do anything about what happened to you. And what are the dangers of that? And then maybe that we'll end with, how do we find some balance in this? And
well, I think when I say normalize, if you're depressed, normalize it. It's my reality. If I have cancer, it's my reality. And I would put depression and cancer in the same category. They're both vicious, and they'll both kill you. And we treat one as if it's normal. This is something we can treat. And then the other one we spiritualize in some way. We stigmatize you for having depression. And I think you have to normalize that. There's a lady named Helen Roosevelt. She was a medical missionary, single lady in Africa. And she wound up, I heard her speak one time, and she was talking about how she had 2 nervous breakdowns and a mental breakdown because of some horrific events that happened in her life on the field. And she talked about them in a normal way. And I asked her, it so shook me up. I was standing in the back of the room, and I thought, you can't do that. Don't say that to these people. They'll think you're weak or something's really wrong with you. And she said, no. She said, why not me? Why shouldn't I have depression? Why shouldn't I have cancer? What makes me separate from anybody else that's experiencing life in the fallen world? And she said, why not me? And then the end product is, she said, I think by the time I walked through it, I was stronger than I was before. So we have pushed this into this ethereal place where we can't access it and just say, this is okay. I'm sorry you're dealing with that, or I'm sorry you're bipolar or whatever. There's a tremendous number of athletes, for instance, that legitimately are bipolar, but they're facing it and they're grappling with it and they communicate it and it's out in the open and they know it and they make whatever accommodations.
So let's
for
take a step back, though. Yes, amen. It is great that, for example, Wesley's generation compared to my generation, and certainly compared to your generation, is more apt to talk about this, discuss it, normalize it. But it feels like, so maybe if we just focus on the culture for a minute, generally speaking, it feels like this has now been given a life of its own, and it's almost like a runaway train, the subject of trauma and self-diagnosis. And so I think the church is afraid of that infiltrating the church. And how do we prevent that, so to speak? But before we comment on that, what's happened in our culture? Why is that so unhelpful? Why has that become so harmful, particularly to your peers in your industry, as a clinical psychologist?
Well, I think about it like kind of like a pendulum swing. Very seldom. I mean, if you pull a pendulum up on one side and drop it, it doesn't stop in the middle. It passes that and goes the other side. So it's not unusual for us to see us overcompensating, and I have, just because we're going to talk about parenting here in a little bit
tonight at Bay Hills, which by the time you listen to this, you're too late.
It won't. I mean, edit that out. But talking about parenting, I've saved parenting books for generations, and it's amazing to me. They just follow the pendulum swing, generation after generation after generation, and it's so regular. No matter what's going on in the culture, it still shows up. Different symptoms, maybe, et cetera, but it's a overcompensation, and then we try to correct, and we make the same mistake again.
So what's the harm in all of this? What are you seeing right now that is particularly harmful and destructive?
We just do not have whole people. We don't have people that are seeking wholeness, which is that back to that integrative
But
thing.
they have a diagnosis.
Well, yeah, and that's, and then that becomes their identity. And all of a sudden they're thinned out even more, and you have more control over them and less individuality, less personality, less wholeness, less significance, less impact, less whatever, less alive.
Yeah.
Actually.
Yeah, the diagnosis it almost takes away your agency.
Yeah, it gives you an identity.
Yeah.
Instead of finding an identity that happens to have a diagnosis part of it.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's fascinating that you specifically brought up the topic of depression, because there's a good friend of mine, and she's my age, and she was telling me about a conversation she had with her mom, and this makes both sides of this very tangible and real. A conversation with her mom where her mother was clearly struggling with depression, went to a church service one day, and then in my friend's words, my mom decided not to be depressed anymore. And that was her approach to it. Then I have my friend who's also dealing with depression, and she's exactly on the other side of the pendulum, saying, oh, this is who I am, and there's not really much that I can do about this. We just lost lights, and we got the lights back. And so I'm stuck in the middle of these two, because there are things that are, I think, admirable about both sides. I admire her mom's wherewithal to continue living life in spite of what she's going through. And I admire my friend's willingness to admit that this is something that she's dealing with. But both of them have taken this approach that, exactly like you're saying, is not integrated.
So maybe a place to land this bird just a little bit is that the middle place where the pendulum should be is the operative term. That's where health takes place. Because if we're aware, we're all vulnerable constantly going in either direction, for instance. and it actually the pendulum swings all over the place. It still has that middle plumb line place that we're looking for that will provide wholeness and anchoredness, et cetera. But because we're alive and we have to be nurtured, and this stuff can't be fixed, and it's not solvable, and it's not supposed to be solvable. It's supposed to be lived through. So it's to be wrestled with and engaged in, and what other words can you use? Grappled, same word as wrestle, but that sounds important, I'm adding words to this. I think people don't. That's what I mean by normalizing it, and we want to avoid that messy, uncomfortable, I'm not sure thing. We want to give solid, clear answers when there aren't any. There's too many variables, and they're all moving. Good luck in finding the sweet spot.
So what advice would you give to, okay, you've got 3 pastors sitting at this table, okay? What advice would you give to us about who are not clinically trained, who are not, professionally trained, that is a little tangible, a little visceral, helpful advice that if you could stand up into a room full of pastors like us and say, here are 2 or 3 things that I would just encourage you to do to navigate this well into this current climate and culture.
Bernard of Clairvaux wrote an article called 4 Degrees of Love. You can look it up, short article. And the highest degree of love, according to him, is the love of self for God's sake. So to every pastor, I would look him in the eye and I'd say, are you loving yourself well for God's sake? Not for your family's sake, not for the church's sake, not for the kingdom's sake, not for some other sake, for God's sake. And that means that you have to start with yourself, because that's all you have to bring. You don't have your family to bring. You just have you to bring. So love yourself well for God's sake, and then see where that takes you, because it will give you a different ride through this valley. And it's the valley that creates fertileness and growth and maturity. It's not the vistas on the top of the mountain. It's the valleys where growth takes place. So don't be afraid of the valleys, embrace them for what they are. And that's why I like J.K. Rowling's statement. She said, rock bottom became the foundation on which I lived my life.
I like, I always found it curious that the book of Acts, when it provides instruction, and I think helpful instruction to the elders of the local church or the leaders of the local church, and it doesn't say look after the church and that whole servant leadership model thing. I'm not sure we got all of that right. That happened, a couple decades ago. What Acts says is look after yourselves, then to the church, then give it away, then to people. And if you can get that order right, then you might be of some earthly good.
That's the whole point. The love of self for God's sake.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Well, thank you for spending this time with us today, and we're so grateful. If anybody wants more information, HudMcWilliams.com, if I remember correctly, and the book that you wrote is The Discipline of Disturbance, which you can now get on Amazon, I understand. That's amazing. So that's a level up. You're in the big time now.
Watch it, baby.
Thank you for joining us on The Hopeful Rebel. Until next time, I'm Pastor Allen.
Parents.
Pastor Wesley.
We'll see you.